The gate does not open with a hand. It opens because the horse stops fighting it. A woman kneels in frozen mud at the edge of a Wyoming corral, her back turned to 1,100 pounds of scarred, wild-eyed animal that has put 2 ranch hands in the hospital this season alone. She is not holding a rope. She is not holding a whip. She is holding a bucket of wet oats and humming something so old it doesn't have a name anymore. And behind her, for the first time in 6 weeks, the stallion has stopped circling. Nobody told her to do this. Nobody thinks it will work. By the time the sun drops behind Heart Mountain, one of them will be forced to trust the other completely, and neither of them chose it. Before we get to that corral, to the smell of burnt leather that nearly ruins everything, and to the man standing at the fence line with a folded piece of paper that could take this whole farm away, you should know where this story happens, and who Brenna really is underneath the coat and the calluses. If you're the kind of person who believes some animals, and some people, only heal each other, stay a minute. Drop your city in the comments, because I want to know how far this story is traveling today. And if this is your first time here, consider subscribing, because next week's story is about a debt no daughter-in-law expected to inherit, and it's even harder to watch than this one. Now, let's go back 6 weeks, to the morning everything on the Whitlock Ranch went quiet. The wind reaches Carbon County before the sun does. It comes down off the Absarokas in long gray sheets, dragging the last brittle cottonwood leaves across 2,000 acres of grass gone the color of old rope, and it does not stop at the fence line of the Whitlock place. It never has. Fences were never built to hold wind, only cattle, and lately not even that. Brenna Whitlock has lived on this land for 11 years, but this particular October, she moves through it like someone walking through a house that used to belong to her. The porch steps still creak on the third board. The barn door still sticks in wet weather. Muscle memory carries her hands to the latch before her eyes have even found it in the dark, and that muscle memory is the only part of her that still believes this place is home. She wakes before 5, the way she always has, though there's no longer a reason to. No husband rolling toward the warm dent she leaves in the mattress. No boots thudding down the hallway ahead of hers. Just the sound of her own breath in a house too big for one person, and the particular silence that settles over rooms where grief has been left to sit for a while, undisturbed, gathering dust like everything else. Outside, the ranch tells its own story before she's had coffee. 60 head of cattle, down from 200. 3 hired hands, down from 9. A hay barn with more empty stalls than full ones, and a line of fence along the north pasture that's needed mending since August and hasn't been touched because there's no one left to send. The town of Meeteetse is 40 minutes south, small enough that everyone already knows what happened to Colton Whitlock, and small enough that they've decided, mostly out loud, what should happen to his widow next. So, that is the word that follows Brenna into the feed store, into church on the Sundays she still forces herself to attend, into the low murmur of voices that stop half a beat too late when she walks into a room. It is offered as kindness. It lands as something closer to erasure, and she has said no to it so many times the word has started to feel less like a decision and more like a wound she keeps reopening on purpose. Because underneath the no is the thing nobody in town knows, and the thing Brenna has not said out loud to a living soul. The last conversation she ever had with her husband was an argument. It was late September, the sky over Heart Mountain doing that violent thing it does before a storm, purple, black, and low, and Colton had come in from the west pasture soaked through and short-tempered, and she had pushed him, gently, she told herself then, gently, about selling off 200 acres to a development group out of Cody. Enough to breathe, enough to stop drowning quietly every winter. He had said no the way he always said no, flat and final, and she had said something she still can't fully remember, something sharp about pride and about dead men's promises, and he had walked back out into the rain without his coat. 40 minutes later, one of the hands found him face down between the barn and the equipment shed, his heart already stopped, the rain still falling on a body that had gone somewhere she couldn't follow. Nobody blames Brenna. Nobody but Brenna blames Brenna. She carries it the way people carry things that can't be set down, folded small, tucked somewhere behind the sternum, taken out only in the hours between 3 and 5 in the morning when the house is too quiet to distract her from it. She has not sold the land. She tells herself it's about Colton's wishes, about the herd, about not giving Meeteetse the satisfaction of being right about a woman alone. The truth, if she let herself look at it straight on, is smaller and harder. She is afraid that if she sells the last thing he died defending, she will have finally finished the argument she started and lost him twice. So she stays. She feeds 60 head of cattle with 2 fewer hands than the job needs. She drives 40 minutes into town for parts and comes home before dark because after dark the house makes sounds that used to be his. And on a Tuesday morning in the second week of October, she gets a phone call from the county extension office that changes the shape of everything. They found horses, 11 of them, rounded up off federal land after a wildfire pushed a wild herd too close to a highway outside Cody. Most have already been placed. One hasn't. A stallion, roan-coated, maybe 8 years old, built like something out of an older century, and by every account she's given, unmanageable. 2 attempts at gentling him have already failed. He's put a volunteer wrangler in urgent care with a broken collarbone. The extension office is calling ranchers up and down the valley, looking for anyone with the facilities and the desperation to take him before the only remaining option becomes a decision nobody wants to make out loud. Brenna doesn't say yes because she has a plan. She says yes because the man on the phone describes the horse's eyes, wide, white-rimmed, unable to settle on anything, and something in her chest recognizes the description before her mind does. She has no rope training beyond what any rancher picks up by necessity. She has no formal experience with wild mustangs. What she has is an empty north pasture, a round pen Colton built the year they married, and a silence in her house so total that the idea of something else needing to be tamed feels less like a burden and more like oxygen. The trailer arrives 2 days later, and the sound that comes out of it when the ramp drops is not a sound Brenna has heard an animal make before. Something between a scream and a warning, hooves striking steel hard enough to dent it, a body throwing itself against the walls of the only world it currently understands. Dale Everson, the driver, doesn't get within 10 feet of the corral gate before he's shaking his head, already halfway back to his truck. That one there, he says, not looking at her directly. That one there might not be gentle able. Some of them aren't. Some of them just aren't built for people. Brenna watches the stallion finally clear the ramp and explode into the round pen. A blur of dust and muscle, roan coat dark with sweat, a jagged white scar running from his left nostril up across the bridge of his nose. Old rope burns still visible in raw pink lines around both front legs. He hits the far rail hard enough that the whole structure shudders, then wheels, chest heaving, eyes rolling white, searching for an exit that isn't there. She doesn't answer Dale. She's already climbing the fence to watch him closer, and something on her face, something the town hasn't seen since the funeral, has gone very still. Maybe he isn't, she says finally, or maybe nobody's asked him the right way yet. Dale looks at her like she said something in another language. Then he gets in his truck and leaves her alone with 1,100 pounds of unbroken grief wearing a horse's shape, and the wind picks up out of the west the way it always does before something in Wyoming is about to change. For 3 days, Brenna does nothing but watch. She doesn't approach the round pen. She doesn't bring feed by hand. She sits on an overturned bucket outside the rail with a mug of coffee going cold in her palms, 20 feet back, and she watches the stallion do the same thing over and over, pace the perimeter, throw his head at nothing, startle at the creak of the windmill, refuse the hay she's forked over the fence until long after she's gone back inside. The 2 hired hands still on payroll, Ruth and a 19-year-old named Dell, find quiet ways to voice what the whole county is already saying out loud. That horse is a lost cause. That money should go toward fence repair, toward vet bills for the actual herd. Ruth finally says it straight to Brenna's face on the 3rd evening, leaning on the fence beside her as the light goes copper over the pasture. You're not doing this for the horse, Ruth says, not looking at her, looking at the animal instead, who has gone still in the far corner, watching them both with an intensity that doesn't belong to a creature that's supposed to be simply dumb and dangerous. Brenna doesn't answer that. She doesn't have an answer that doesn't require saying Colton's name out loud, and she's not ready for that yet. Not with Ruth, not with anyone. On the 4th morning, she does something none of them expect. She walks into the barn, finds the small tin bucket that used to hold Colton's shaving kit, dumps it out, and fills it instead with a scoop of oats soaked in warm water until it goes soft and sweet-smelling. Then she walks to the round pen gate, lets herself in, and sits down in the dirt roughly 15 feet from the stallion, her back to him. Dell, watching from the barn doorway, mutters something to Ruth about liability. Ruth doesn't answer him. She's seen this kind of quiet determination in a person exactly once before, and it was in Colton Whitlock the year he decided to marry a girl from Sheridan who'd never so much as branded a calf. The horse goes rigid the second the gate closes. He backs into the far rail, head high, nostrils flared wide enough to show the pink inside, every muscle coiled toward flight that has nowhere left to go. Brenna doesn't turn around. She sets the bucket down beside her, close enough that the scent can carry, but not close enough to feel like a demand, and she starts, very quietly, to hum. It isn't a song with words, not really. Fragments of a lullaby her own grandmother used to sing over a wood stove in a kitchen that smelled like sourdough and kerosene, half remembered, low in her chest, more breath than melody. She hums it to the dirt in front of her, to the fence posts, to nothing in particular, and she does not look at the horse once. Minutes pass. The wind moves through the dry grass beyond the corral in long, slow waves. Somewhere behind her, the stallion's breathing starts to change, the sharp, ragged edge of panic softening by fractions into something merely wary. She doesn't get closer that day. She doesn't touch him. She simply sits until her legs go numb and the sun drops low enough to turn the dust motes gold. And then she rises slowly, leaves the bucket where it is, and walks out without a backward glance. When she comes back the next morning, the oats are gone. Not scattered, not spilled in panic, eaten. The bucket nosed a few feet from where she left it, as if something had needed to move it and look at it and decide, alone in the dark, that it wasn't a trap. She does the same thing the second day, the third. Each time, she sits a little closer, 14 feet, then 12, then 10, and each time she hums the same half-forgotten song into the space between them, patient in a way that has nothing to do with technique and everything to do with having nowhere else she needs to be. By the sixth day, something in the stallion's posture has changed enough that even Dell notices it from the barn. He no longer flattens himself into the far corner when she enters. He stands, watching, ears swiveling toward her voice instead of away from it, and once, just once, he takes 2 slow steps closer before catching himself and freezing, as if surprised by his own body. Brenna feels that moment happen behind her without turning around to confirm it. Something in her chest, tight and closed for 6 weeks, loosens by 1 single degree. She has not told anyone why this matters to her the way it does. She has not said, even to herself in so many words, that a wild animal refusing to be touched and a woman refusing to be consoled are, underneath everything, doing exactly the same thing. But on the 7th morning, when she sits down in the dirt 8 feet from him and he does not retreat, does not toss his head, only watches her with those wide dark eyes gone 1 shade less frantic than the week before, something in her throat goes tight enough that she has to stop humming for a moment, just to breathe through it. That's the moment Kalen Marsh's truck turns up the long gravel drive, dust boiling behind it in the cold morning air, and everything that has been happening quietly in that round pen is about to stop being private. Kalen doesn't get out of the truck right away. He sits with the engine idling, one forearm resting on the open window, taking in the scene with the particular stillness of a man deciding how much of what he's about to say he actually means. He and Colton were partners once, not on paper, but in the way ranchers in a thin valley become partners out of necessity, sharing equipment, splitting the cost of a bull, standing next to each other at brandings for a decade. He was at the funeral. He sent a card that Brenna still hasn't opened, and he owns, along with 3 other families on the county water board, the kind of leverage that makes a widow's failure very convenient. He steps down from the truck slow, boots crunching gravel, and walks to the round pen fence without being invited. And for a long moment, he simply looks at the horse the way a man looks at a hand of cards he already suspects is losing. That the Cody Stallion, he says finally, the one put Trevor Aldous in the hospital. Brenna doesn't stand. She stays kneeling in the dirt, the bucket empty beside her, the stallion 12 feet behind her with his head low and watchful. That's the one, she says. Kalen's jaw works for a second before he speaks again, and when he does, the words come out careful, rehearsed somewhere on the drive over. The water board met Thursday. There's been talk he didn't start, he's careful to say, though nobody believes that particular disclaimer, about whether a single woman running a place this size, shorthanded, behind on fence work, taking in unmanageable livestock nobody else wants, constitutes what the county paperwork calls an unviable holding. The phrase lands exactly the way he intends it to. Brenna finally stands, brushing dirt from her knees, and meets his eyes across the fence rail with an expression that gives away far less than what's happening underneath it. There's a clause, he continues, in the original water share agreement your husband signed. First right of purchase, triggered if the property's declared unable to sustain its operational obligations. He doesn't relish saying it. That much, at least, seems true. But it's real, Brenna. And there's already 3 names on the board ready to vote for it. The wind picks up between them, carrying dust off the pasture, and behind her the stallion shifts his weight, ears pinned toward the stranger's voice. Brenna doesn't ask him why he's really here, standing at her fence at 8 in the morning instead of calling, because she already knows the answer sits somewhere between old loyalty to Colton and the plain economic fact that the Whitlock Springs are the last unclaimed water source in a valley gone dry 3 years running. So what's the offer, she says. Because there's always an offer. Kalen looks at the horse for a long moment before he answers, and something shifts behind his eyes. Not cruelty, exactly. Closer to a man handing someone a rope he genuinely believes might save her, even as it doubles as the thing that could hang her. Prove it, he says. Prove the place is viable. Gentle that horse, saddle him, ride him, something the whole valley can see with their own eyes, by sunset today. You do that, I'll stand up at the next board meeting and kill the unviable holding motion myself. I've got the votes to do it if I've got the reason. And if I can't, Brenna says. Kalen doesn't answer that part directly. He doesn't have to. The silence does it for him. And so does the folded paper he sets on the top rail of the fence before he turns back toward his truck. An official notice, already drafted, already dated, needing only a board signature to set the whole machine into motion. He pauses at the truck door, one hand on the frame, and looks back at her one more time. And for a second something almost like an apology crosses his face. Colton would have told you to sell 2 years ago, he says, quiet now. Everybody knows he wouldn't have. That's not what I mean. I mean he'd have told you there's no shame in it. There wasn't. There still isn't. He drives off before she can answer, gravel spitting behind the tires, and Brenna is left standing at the fence with a folded legal document trembling slightly in the wind, a half-tamed wild stallion breathing hard behind her, and roughly 9 hours of daylight left to prove something to an entire valley that has already decided, mostly, what the answer is going to be. She turns back to the horse. He is watching her with an intensity that makes her chest ache in a way she can't name yet. And somewhere behind her ribs, the old lullaby rises up again on its own, unbidden, the only language she has left that feels like it might actually be true. She goes to the tack room first, because a plan, even a bad one, even one built entirely on 9 hours and a song her grandmother used to sing, needs at least the shape of preparation. The tack room hasn't been touched since March. Colton's saddle still sits on its rack, the leather gone stiff with disuse, and above it, hung on a nail he drove in himself the winter they married, his old work jacket, waxed canvas, oil-stained at the cuffs, the collar worn soft from a decade of weather. Brenna hasn't been able to give it away. She hasn't been able to look at it directly, either, and today, moving fast, thinking about time rather than grief, she doesn't think about it at all. She simply grabs it off the nail, because the morning has turned sharp and cold and her own coat is still inside the house, and she shrugs it on without a second thought. The sleeves too long, the smell of him, wood smoke, machine oil, something underneath that is just him, closing around her like a hand. She carries a coiled lead rope and a hackamore. No bit, nothing metal near his mouth, out to the round pen, moving slower now, more deliberate, aware of every second the sun is climbing. The stallion is waiting at the far rail when she comes through the gate, and for 6 days that has meant something close to progress. A horse who no longer flees the moment she enters, who watches instead of bolts. But the second she steps inside the pen wearing Colton's jacket, everything reverses at once. He doesn't just retreat. He explodes, a full-body flinch that sends him crashing backward into the rail hard enough to splinter wood. Then wheeling, half-rearing, a sound tearing out of him that Brenna has never heard from an animal before, high and raw and unmistakably terror rather than aggression. He throws himself against the far side of the pen twice, 3 times, foam gathering at the corners of his mouth, eyes rolled back to show white all the way around. And for one heart-stopping second, Brenna thinks he's going to go through the fence entirely. She freezes exactly where she is, rope forgotten in her hand, and every instinct in her says retreat, get out. This was a mistake, and underneath that, quieter, something else says wait. Because this isn't the wariness of 6 days ago. This is specific. This is targeted. And it started the moment she walked in wearing that jacket. She backs slowly toward the gate, unclips it, steps through, and the second the jacket is out of the pen with her, the stallion's panic breaks like a fever, his breathing still ragged but no longer climbing, his legs trembling but no longer throwing him at the fence rail. He stands in the far corner, chest heaving, watching her the way you watch something you're not sure has finished trying to kill you. Ruth has come out onto the porch at the sound of splintering wood, and she crosses the yard fast, face tight with alarm, already scanning Brenna for injury before her eyes land on the jacket, still hanging off her shoulders. That's Colton's, Ruth says, and it isn't a question, and something in her voice has gone careful, the way people get careful around things that used to belong to the dead. Brenna looks down at herself as if she's only now noticing what she put on, and slowly, understanding moves across her face the way weather moves across open country, visible from a long way off before it actually arrives. Dale Everson mentioned it in passing, days ago, in a detail she'd let slide past her at the time. This particular stallion's herd had been run off federal land during roundup operations 2 years back. The same operations, the same stretch of country, where a contract crew working under a different rancher's name had once used leather conditioning treatments and branding tools that left a very specific, very sharp burnt leather smell hanging over a holding pen for weeks. A pen this horse, young then, had likely been trapped in. A smell that, for reasons that have nothing to do with sense and everything to do with survival, has apparently wired itself into the deepest, most animal part of him as a warning that means pain is coming. And Colton's jacket, worn for a decade of branding seasons, saturated at the collar and cuffs with exactly that same scorched, oiled leather smell, has just walked into this horse's world wearing the ghost of the thing that hurt him most. Brenna stands very still in the cold morning light, the jacket suddenly heavy on her shoulders in a way that has nothing to do with its weight, and something she's been holding at arm's length for 6 weeks finally, quietly, catches up to her. She has spent a season believing this horse's fear was simple, a wild animal reacting to captivity, to strangers, to rope. She hadn't considered that some fears are specific, that they have a shape, a scent, a history, that you can carry the exact thing that once hurt you without ever meaning to, and the people, or animals, around you can smell it on you before you even know it's there. She peels the jacket off slowly, holding it away from her body, and looks back through the rails at the stallion, who has gone still again, watching her with something that isn't quite trust yet, but isn't the raw terror of 5 minutes ago either. "I'm sorry," she says, so quietly Ruth almost doesn't catch it. "I didn't know I was still wearing him." Ruth doesn't ask what that means. She's known Brenna long enough, and grief long enough, to understand that some sentences aren't meant to be explained, only witnessed. She takes the jacket from Brenna's hands without a word and carries it back toward the house. And Brenna is left alone at the rail with a horse who has just, without meaning to, told her something true about both of them, that the past doesn't stay folded up neatly where you leave it. It rides along in the fabric of things. It waits to be smelled, recognized, reckoned with. The sun has climbed another notch toward noon. Somewhere out past the north pasture, dust rises faintly along the county road. A truck, maybe two, headed this direction, drawn by the kind of news that travels faster in a small valley than weather does. Brenna wipes her palms on her jeans, walks back to the gate, and lets herself into the pen one more time. In her own coat this time, nothing borrowed, nothing haunted, and sits down again in the dirt, farther back than she's been in days, ready to start over from a place of honesty instead of habit. The stallion watches her a long moment. Then, slowly, he takes one step closer. Word moves through a valley like me-teetsy the way water moves through a dry creek bed, fast, and along channels that already exist. By 11 that morning, 4 trucks are parked along the county road above the Whitlock place, engines off, doors open, men and women leaning against tailgates with coffee thermoses and the particular patience of people who've decided a woman's failure is worth watching in person. Kalen's truck is among them, though he stays inside the cab longer than the others, watching through the windshield with an expression none of his neighbors can quite read. Brenna is aware of the audience the way you're aware of weather building on the horizon, present, gathering, not yet arrived. She doesn't look at the road. She keeps her attention on the horse, on the 8 feet of trampled dirt between them, on the low hum of a lullaby that has become, over the last hour, less a technique and more the only honest thing she has left to offer him. The stallion has closed the distance to 6 feet, then 5, each gain measured not in bold strides but in small, trembling increments. A step forward, a full-body flinch, a long pause where he simply stands and breathes and decides, apparently, not to run. Brenna doesn't reach for him. She doesn't so much as turn her head. She sits with her back angled just enough that he can see her without feeling watched, the empty oat bucket beside her, her hands loose and open in her lap. It's Ruth who notices first, from the fence line, that something in the shape of the encounter has shifted. Not the horse's caution. That's still there, coiled under the surface like it'll always be there. But his direction. He isn't circling anymore. He isn't testing the perimeter for an exit. He's angled his whole body toward the woman sitting in the dirt, ears forward, head lowering by degrees. And there's a stillness in him now that looks less like the frozen stillness of fear and more like the stillness of an animal choosing, for the first time and longer than anyone can guess, not to flee something it easily could. At 4 feet, he stops. Brenna stops humming. For a long moment, neither of them moves at all, and the only sound in the whole corral is wind moving through dry grass and, faint and distant, the murmur of onlookers up on the road who have started, without quite meaning to fall silent too. Then the stallion lowers his head the rest of the way and closes the final distance himself. His muzzle brushes her shoulder first, the lightest possible contact, a question more than a touch. And when Brenna doesn't flinch, doesn't reach for him, doesn't do anything but let out a slow breath she's been holding for what feels like 6 weeks, he presses his nose more firmly against her, into the curve of her neck, breathing in the scent of her the way he spent the last week breathing in the scent of soaked oats and human patience, and a voice that never once demanded anything of him. Brenna closes her eyes. Her hand comes up slowly, not to grab, not to hold, just to rest, palm flat, against the warm plane of his cheek, and he lets it stay there. Somewhere up on the road, someone lets out a low whistle. Someone else says something too quiet to carry. Kalen, still sitting in his truck, sets down the coffee he hasn't drunk a sip of and simply watches, jaw tight, something working behind his eyes that looks less like satisfaction and more like a man watching a bet he placed on the wrong side of history. But this is only contact. Trust that lets a hand rest on a cheek is not the same as trust that accepts a rope, a hackamore, a rider's weight. And there are still hours of daylight left, and an audience that came to watch either a triumph or a very public failure. And Brenna knows, even with the warmth of the stallion's breath against her palm, that the hardest part of the day hasn't started yet. She reaches slowly for the coiled lead rope beside her, moving with the same unhurried patience that's gotten her this far, and the stallion's ears flick at the sound of it. Not panic, not yet, but awareness, old memories stirring somewhere behind those dark eyes. Easy, she says, so quiet it's barely more than breath. Just this, nothing you don't choose. The rope uncoils in her hand. The horse watches it the way you watch a door you're not sure yet whether to walk through. And up on the road, 40 people who came expecting to see a widow fail are, for the first time all morning, entirely silent, waiting to find out which way this goes. The hackamore takes longer than the rope. Brenna works without gloves, because gloves put a layer between her hands and whatever the stallion needs to feel from them. And by early afternoon her fingers have gone raw from cold and rope burn and the particular strain of moving slow when every instinct screams to move fast before the light changes its mind. She doesn't force it over his head. She lets him smell it first, lets it hang loose in her open palm for what feels like 20 minutes while he lips at it, startles from it, returns to it, decides in his own private calculus that it isn't the thing that hurt him before. When it finally slides into place, ears back, but body still, she feels something in her own chest unknot that she didn't fully realize had been clenched the entire day. The crowd on the road has grown. Word has reached town proper now, and there are more trucks than the shoulder can comfortably hold, more folded arms and squinting eyes, and the low murmuring commentary of people watching a spectacle they've already half-written the ending too. Kalen has finally gotten out of his truck. He stands apart from the others, close enough to the fence to see clearly, far enough to keep whatever this is at arm's length. And when Brenna glances his way once, just once, checking the sun's position more than checking him, his face gives away nothing at all. It's somewhere in the space between the hackamore going on and the moment she first lays a saddle blanket across the stallion's back that Ruth appears at the gate, out of breath, holding something that makes Brenna's whole body go still in a way that has nothing to do with the horse. A letter, folded, yellowed slightly at the creases, Colton's handwriting unmistakable across the front. Ruth found it. She explains, fast and low, tucked behind a support beam in the equipment shed while looking for a missing bridle, sealed in a plastic sleeve like something meant to survive weather, meant to be found eventually by someone. It's addressed to Brenna. She doesn't open it. Not yet. She can't. Not with the stallion's weight balanced on the edge of trust. Not with 40 pairs of eyes on the road waiting to see if a saddle goes on next. Not with the sun already sliding past its highest point toward the long, slow decline that will, one way or another, decide this by evening. She tucks the letter inside her coat, against her chest, where she can feel the shape of it through the fabric like a second heartbeat, and she goes back to work because there is no version of this day where she gets to stop and grieve properly before it's finished testing her. The saddle blanket stays. The horse tolerates the light weight of it across his withers with only minor flinching, ears swiveling but feet planted, and when Brenna finally lifts the saddle itself, old, cracked, Colton's saddle, the only one on the property built for a horse this size, the stallion's whole body goes rigid. This is the moment everyone on the road leans forward for. This is the moment 2 previous handlers failed at. The moment that put a man in the hospital with a broken collarbone. The moment that separates a horse who tolerates a hand on his cheek from a horse who can actually be worked, ridden, trusted with a person's full weight. Brenna doesn't rush it. She lets the saddle hover, lets him see it, smell it, understand its shape before it ever touches him. And when she finally lowers it onto his back, slow as falling snow, he shifts his weight hard to one side, ears pinned flat, a warning sound rumbling low in his chest that every rancher on that road recognizes as the sound that comes right before a horse puts someone through a fence. She doesn't retreat. She stays exactly where she is, one hand flat against his shoulder, her voice dropping back into that same half-remembered lullaby. And for 3 long seconds the entire valley seems to be holding its breath along with her. Then the stallion's ears come forward, just slightly. His weight settles back onto all 4 legs. The warning sound in his chest fades into something closer to a long, shuddering exhale. The saddle stays. Up on the road, someone starts clapping, and someone else tells them to hush, because the day isn't over yet, because a saddled horse still has to accept a rider, and the light is already starting to lean gold and long across the pasture. And there is still one letter, unopened, sitting against Brenna's chest like a question she isn't ready to answer. She doesn't read the letter until the saddle is cinched and the stallion has taken 3 slow, obedient steps at the end of the lead rope, ears forward, following her voice instead of fighting it. She reads it standing at the rail, hands shaking slightly, because some part of her already knows that whatever's inside is going to cost her something she doesn't yet have a name for. Colton's handwriting fills 2 pages, dated the morning of the storm, written hours, maybe only minutes, before the argument that would be their last conversation. He doesn't write about the fight to come. He couldn't have known. What he writes about instead is the herd of wild Mustangs recently pushed off federal land near Cody, a rescue operation running out of funding, and a decision he'd apparently made alone, weeks before he died, to quietly co-sign a private loan to keep the rescue afloat, using their own ranch, their own water rights, as collateral he never told her about. He didn't tell you. The letter explains in his own plain, careful hand, because you'd have said no, and you'd have been right too, and I didn't want you carrying a debt you never agreed to. If this ever gets found, know I did it because some things deserve saving even when the math says otherwise. Ask Kalen if you need help sorting out the paper. He knows more than he's said, probably. He always does. Brenna reads it twice, then a 3rd time, standing very still while the stallion shifts his weight beside her, patient now in a way that would have seemed impossible 6 days ago. The debt Kalen mentioned this morning. The shortfall driving the county's talk of an unviable holding motion. The pressure squeezing every corner of this ranch since Colton died didn't start with her mismanagement or her grief or her stubbornness. It started with her husband secretly betting the family's entire future on saving exactly the kind of animal currently standing saddled beside her, breathing warm and steady into the cold afternoon air. This horse isn't just a wild Mustang she chose to gentle out of loneliness and desperation. He's the last living piece of a promise Colton made and died before he could keep. A promise he hid from her specifically so it wouldn't become one more thing she'd have to carry. And carrying it now, standing in the corral with his saddle under her hand and his letter shaking in her fingers, Brenna understands with sudden, sickening clarity exactly what selling this horse would mean. It would clear the debt. It would satisfy the water board tonight, this evening, with hours to spare before any vote. It would almost certainly save the ranch outright. It would also mean undoing the very last thing her husband did to protect something he loved without asking anyone's permission. The last secret, the last sacrifice, the last piece of him left standing in the world that hasn't already been spent, sold, or grieved into stillness. Brenna folds the letter along its worn creases and tucks it back inside her coat. And when she looks up, Kalen has crossed from the road down to the near side of the fence, close enough now that she can read on his face the thing she already suspected that he knew. Maybe not everything, but enough. You knew about this, she says. It isn't an accusation exactly, though it lands like one. Kalen's jaw tightens. Some of it, he admits. Colton mentioned the loan the week before he died. Didn't tell me the collateral. I figured that part out same time you probably did. Sometime around when the water board started asking hard questions about your books. You could have told me. Would it have changed anything you've done today? He says, and there's no cruelty in it, just a tired kind of honesty that seems to cost him something to offer. You were going to fight for that horse whether or not you understood why he mattered. Maybe more, if you'd known too soon. Grief does strange math. The stallion shifts again, nudging gently at Brenna's shoulder, patient, waiting, entirely unaware that he has just become the center of a decision far larger than a single afternoon in a round pen. Behind Kalen, up on the road, the crowd has grown thicker, and the sun has dropped low enough now to throw everyone's shadow long and thin across the dry grass. And somewhere out past the ridge a hawk cries once, sharp and distant, the kind of sound that in Wyoming has always meant something is about to change whether the valley is ready or not. The board meets tonight, Kalen says, glancing once toward the road where three men who sit on that waterboard are leaning against a truck bed, watching. 7 o'clock, the Grange Hall. I told you this morning what I need to walk in there with. A working ranch. A widow who can hold what her husband left her. He hesitates, and for the first time since he pulled up this morning, something almost apologetic crosses his weathered face. There's another option, though, he adds, quieter now. Sell the horse. There's a buyer already circling, private outfit out of Jackson, does exhibition stock, pays premium for a Mustang with this kind of bloodline and this kind of story behind him. Enough to clear the loan outright by tonight. No vote needed. No motion. No more fighting a board that's already half decided against you. It would be over, he says. Tonight. Clean. Brenna looks past him, back to the horse now standing quiet at her shoulder, saddle settled, hackamore loose in her hand, his dark eyes following the sound of Kalen's voice with the same wary alertness he's carried since the trailer first dropped its ramp 6 days ago. She thinks of Colton's letter, folded against her ribs. Some things deserve saving even when the math says otherwise. She thinks, too, of the argument that killed him, of pride, of dead men's promises, of the exact same accusation she'd flung at her husband in the rain, now circling back to test her from the other direction. Everyone in the valley, everyone on that road, is waiting to see whether Brenna Whitlock has learned anything at all from the thing she said the last time she ever spoke to him. Selling the horse would silence every doubt by sundown. It would also mean standing in the same spot her husband stood, weeks before he died, and making the exact choice he refused to make, trading away the thing he'd already decided was worth the risk, worth the debt, worth keeping even when keeping it cost everything. Brenna's hand tightens slightly on the lead rope. The stallion, sensing something in the shift of her body, presses his head gently against her chest, right where the letter sits folded against her heart, and holds it there. No, she says. Kalen blinks. No to which part? No to selling him. She says, steadier now. the words settling into her chest like something finally finding its proper shape. And no to proving anything tonight by riding him into town like a trophy. I'm not doing this to win a bet, Kaylin. I'm doing it because my husband already decided this animal was worth saving, and I am done letting other people finish his sentences for him. Then what do you want me to tell the board? He says, and there's no challenge left in it now. Only genuine uncertainty. A man watching a plan he thought he understood come apart into something he didn't anticipate. Brenna looks out at the crowd along the road. 40, maybe 50 people now, waiting to watch either a triumph or a failure, having already decided, mostly, which one they expect. Tell them the truth, she says. Tell them I'm not selling the water rights, and I'm not selling this horse. And instead of proving the ranch can survive the way it used to, I'm going to prove it can survive as something different. A sanctuary, rehabilitation, gentling, retraining rescued stock nobody else wants. Starting with him. Kaylin studies her for a long moment, and something behind his eyes shifts. Not agreement exactly, but the particular respect of a man watching someone choose the harder, less certain road on purpose, with her eyes open. That's not proof, Brenna. That's a promise. Board doesn't vote on promises. Then I'll show them something better than a promise, she says, and turns back to the stallion, gathering the lead rope shorter in her hand. The sun already tipping past 4 in the afternoon, the light going long and amber across the dead grass. And somewhere behind her ribs, underneath the fear, underneath the grief, underneath the letters still pressed warm against her chest, something that has been frozen since the night of the storm finally, quietly, begins to move again. The mounting takes longer than anyone on the road expects, and every minute of it is washed in a silence that has stopped being skeptical and started becoming something closer to reverence. Brenna doesn't climb up right away. She spends nearly 20 minutes simply leaning her weight across the saddle from the ground, easing pressure onto the stallion's back in small increments, retreating the instant his muscles go tight, returning the moment they ease. Ruth watches from the fence with her hands pressed flat against her mouth. When Brenna finally swings her leg over and settles her full weight into the saddle, the stallion's whole body goes rigid beneath her, ears flat, spine arched, every ounce of wild animal in him screaming at once that this is the moment, the exact configuration of danger his body has been trained by trauma to associate with pain, with ropes, with the acrid ghost scent of burnt leather that nearly ended everything 6 hours earlier. He doesn't buck. He doesn't bolt. He stands utterly still, trembling in every muscle, and Brenna sits equally still above him, reins loose, voice dropping back into that same fragile half-song, and the two of them remain locked in that frozen, shaking silence for what feels, to everyone watching, like the longest minute of the entire day. Then, slowly, the stallion's ears come forward. His spine softens, and when Brenna finally asks him, with the lightest possible pressure of her heel, to take one step forward, he does. The crowd on the road doesn't cheer. It's too quiet a moment for cheering, too fragile, too clearly built on something none of them fully understand. Instead, there's a kind of collective exhale, a murmur passing person to person like wind through grass, and somewhere among them Kaylin stands with his arms crossed and his expression finally, unmistakably, unguarded. They walk the perimeter of the round pen twice, horse and rider moving together with a caution that will likely take months, maybe longer, to fully soften into trust. It is not triumphant. It is not the kind of taming that makes for an easy, tidy ending. But it is real, and it is enough. And when Brenna finally reins the stallion to a stop in the center of the pen and slides down from the saddle, her legs nearly buckle beneath her, not from fear, but from the particular exhaustion of having held herself together, inch by inch, for 6 straight days. The stallion turns his head and presses his nose once more against her chest, directly over the place where Colton's letter still sits folded against her heart, and holds it there a long moment, breathing her in, before finally, gently, pulling away. Up on the road, the sun has dropped to within a finger's width of the ridgeline, throwing the whole valley into deep gold, and the water board members standing among the crowd are already exchanging glances that suggest tonight's meeting is going to look very different than the one Kaylin walked in expecting to argue for this morning. But the day isn't finished testing her yet. As the crowd begins to disperse, engines turning over one by one along the road, Kaylin lingers at the fence, And there's something in the set of his shoulders that tells Brenna the hardest conversation of the day hasn't happened yet. There's one more thing in that letter, he says quietly, once the others are out of earshot. One I already knew about, and should have told you before now. Brenna's stomach tightens. What? Colton wrote to the county land trust too, he says. 6 weeks before he died. Not just about the loan. About what happens to the ranch if the herd numbers ever dropped below sustaining level and he wasn't around to fix it. He put it in writing, Brenna. If the operation ever failed outright, he wanted the land to go to the community trust. Not to you outright. To the trust, to be managed collectively, water rights included. The wind moves through the empty round pen, stirring dust around the stallion's legs. And for a long moment Brenna simply stares at Kalen, the whole shape of the day rearranging itself around a piece of information she wasn't prepared to carry. He was protecting you, Kalen adds, quieter now, from having to run it alone if it all fell apart. He didn't think you'd want to. Brenna's hand goes instinctively to her chest, to the letter still folded there, and something in her voice, when it finally comes, is raw in a way it hasn't been all day. He didn't ask me, she says. He never asked me anything. He just decided, over and over, what I could and couldn't carry, and now I'm supposed to prove I can carry all of it, alone, using a plan he never even told me was possible. Kalen doesn't have an answer for that, not one that would help, and he seems to know it, standing at the fence with his hat in his hands now instead of on his head, the gesture of a man who understands he has just handed a grieving woman a second grief to carry on top of the first. Brenna doesn't ask him to stay, and he doesn't offer to. He simply nods once, tells her the board meeting is still at 7, that whatever she decides to bring to it will be her decision and no one else's this time, and drives back down the gravel road with the rest of the trucks, leaving her alone in the gathering dusk with a saddled stallion, an empty pasture, and a letter that has just doubled in weight. She stands at the rail for a long time after the last engine fades. The stallion, freed of the saddle now, grazes quietly a few yards off, occasionally lifting his head to check her position the way he started doing over the last 6 days, a small unconscious tether that has replaced the panic of the first afternoon. The land trust clause changes nothing about tonight's vote, not directly. Kalen was clear about that before he left, his old loyalty to Colton apparently strong enough to make sure she understood the difference between what could happen eventually and what's being decided this evening. But it changes something quieter, something underneath the practical facts. It means the promise Brenna made to herself this afternoon, to build something new out of what's left, a sanctuary instead of a shrinking cattle operation, was never fully hers to make alone. Colton had already imagined a version of the future where she couldn't hold this place by herself, and had quietly built an exit ramp for her without asking whether she wanted one. It is, in its own way, exactly the argument they had the night he died, playing out one more time from beyond it. Whether pride is worth the risk of failing alone, or whether love sometimes means deciding for someone else what they can bear. Brenna sits down on the overturned bucket at the edge of the pen, the same one she's used for 6 days, and for the first time since the funeral, she lets herself cry without immediately trying to stop it. Not loud, not dramatic, just steady and quiet. The kind of grief that has been rationed out in careful, controlled doses for 6 weeks finally spending itself all at once in the fading light. The stallion lifts his head at the sound. He watches her a moment, ears forward, and then, unprompted, uninvited, walks the short distance across the pen and lowers his head until his muzzle rests against the top of her bowed head, warm breath stirring her hair, standing utterly still while she cries into the dusk. Nobody taught him to do that. Nobody trained it. It is simply, plainly, the same offering she gave him 6 days ago in this exact dirt. Presence without demand, patience without agenda. Return now, in the only language he has, at the exact moment she needs it most. She doesn't know how long they stay like that. Long enough that the sky shifts fully from gold to the deep, bruised purple that comes just before true dark. Long enough that the first stars start to prick through above the ridgeline. And when she finally lifts her head and wipes her face with the back of one raw, rope-burned hand, something in her has settled that wasn't settled an hour ago. She isn't going to sell the horse. She isn't going to let the land trust clause make the decision for her either. Not tonight. Not without a fight of her own choosing. Colton spent his last weeks quietly deciding what she could and couldn't survive without ever once asking her. and she is done, finally, letting anyone else, living or dead, answer that question on her behalf. She stands, brushes the dirt from her jeans, and looks at the stallion one more time in the gathering dark. "We're not finished yet," she tells him, and her voice, for the first time all day, sounds like it belongs entirely to her. The Grange Hall in Meeteetsy smells like it always has. Coffee gone bitter in a percolator too old to make it any other way. Wood polish, the faint mineral tang of a wood stove that's been heating this building since before half the people in it were born. By 7 o'clock it's full, more full than Brenna has seen it since Colton's funeral reception. Folding chairs pulled into uneven rows, the low murmur of a valley's worth of opinions waiting to be spoken out loud. She walks in with dirt still under her fingernails and a rope burn raw across her left palm. Wearing her own coat this time, Colton's letter folded in the inside pocket where she can feel its shape against her ribs like a second pulse. She doesn't sit. She stands near the front, beside the waterboard's folding table, and waits for the meeting to come to order with a stillness that costs her more than anyone in the room can see. The unviable holding motion is first on the agenda. It always was going to be, regardless of what happened in that round pen. County paperwork moves on its own schedule, indifferent to the private reckonings of the people it affects. Kalen sits at the board table with the two other members, and when the motion is formally read aloud, his face gives away nothing at all. Public comment opens, and for a long, uncomfortable stretch, it goes exactly the way Brenna expected it might a month ago, before any of this started. A neighbor 2 properties over stands and speaks, not unkindly but plainly, about fence lines gone unmended, about herd numbers that have dropped every season since Colton died, about the practical reality of a single person trying to run land built for a family, a crew, a partnership. Someone else raises the drought, the springs, the simple math of water in a valley that doesn't have enough of it to go around anymore. Brenna listens to all of it without interrupting, because none of it is untrue, and she has spent 6 weeks calling it exactly the same thing in the privacy of her own kitchen at 3 in the morning. When it's finally her turn, she doesn't bring notes. She doesn't need them. She tells the room, plainly and without asking for their pity, about the letter Ruth found in the equipment shed, about the loan Colton signed in secret to save a herd of Mustangs he never told her he was protecting, about the debt that's been driving this whole crisis long before anyone in this room ever framed it as a question of whether a widow could hold her own land. She doesn't perform grief for them. She simply lays the facts down one at a time, the way you'd lay out tools you intend to actually use. Then she tells them what she wants to build instead of what she's lost. Not a cattle operation stretched thin across land it can no longer support with the hands available to her. A working equine rehabilitation sanctuary, using the exact skills she spent 6 days discovering she has, taking in exactly the kind of unmanageable, traumatized, unwanted animals that no one else in this valley wants to touch, funded in part by exhibition and training contracts, in part by partnering with the same federal rescue programs that brought this stallion to her gate in the first place. It isn't a fully formed plan. She says as much, out loud, refusing to dress it up as more finished than it is. But it's honest, and it's specific, and standing at the front of that room with rope burns on her hands and a dead man's letter against her ribs, she says the thing she spent 6 weeks refusing to say to anyone, including herself. "I'm not asking you to believe I can do this because I already have it figured out," she says, her voice steady even as her hands are not. "I'm asking you to believe I can do it because I've spent the last 6 days proving, to myself more than anyone, that I know how to sit still with something wild and wait for it to trust me. That's not nothing. That might be exactly the skill this place needs most right now. The silence that follows isn't hostile. It's the particular silence of a room recalculating something it thought it had already decided." Kalen speaks last, before the vote. He doesn't offer the horse, the sanctuary plan, or even Brenna herself as the deciding factor. He simply tells the room, in his own plain way, what he watched happen in that round pen this afternoon. A wild animal that 2 trained handlers had already failed to gentle, standing calm under saddle by sunset, because someone was willing to sit in the dirt and wait as long as it took. Sometimes, he says, that's the only proof a valley like this one actually understands. The motion fails, 5 votes to 2, and the sound that moves through the Grange Hall afterward isn't quite applause, but it's close enough to it that Brenna has to look down at her hands for a moment, steadying herself against a relief so total it feels almost like grief all over again. She doesn't drive straight home. She sits alone in her truck in the gravel lot outside the Grange Hall for a long while after the crowd disperses. Engine off. The letter finally unfolded fully across her lap for the first time since Ruth handed it to her that morning. She reads it slower this time, without the pressure of daylight running out, without an audience waiting on the road. And on the second page, in a line she skimmed past in the rush of the afternoon, she finds something she missed. Colton had written, near the bottom, in handwriting slightly less careful than the rest, as if the thought had arrived to him mid-sentence and demanded to be included before he lost his nerve. If none of this works, if the ranch doesn't hold, if I'm not around to see it through, don't let anyone tell you staying was foolish. I picked you because you don't quit on things just because they're hard to love. That includes this place. That includes me. It probably always will. Brenna sits with that sentence a long time. The truck cab gone cold around her, the Grange Hall's windows dimming one by one behind her as the last few board members lock up for the night. It doesn't erase the argument. It doesn't undo the last thing she ever said to him, sharp and unkind, moments before the sky opened up and his heart gave out in the mud between the barn and the shed. Some things, she is starting to understand, don't get undone. They only get carried differently, over time, until the weight of them changes shape without ever fully disappearing. But it tells her something she didn't have this morning. That Colton, in his own flawed, secretive, overprotective way, had already forgiven the argument before it even happened, had already decided, in ink, weeks before the storm, that whatever imperfect, difficult, unfinished thing existed between them was worth staying for anyway. She folds the letter carefully back along its creases and starts the truck, and the drive home along the dark county road feels different than it has in 6 weeks. Not lighter exactly, not resolved, but no longer quite so much like walking through a house that used to belong to her. The Stallion is waiting at the round pen fence when her headlights sweep across the yard, a pale shape in the darkness, ears pricked toward the sound of the engine the way he started doing every evening since the third day. Brenna cuts the lights, sits a moment in the quiet, and then walks out to him without bothering to turn on the yard floodlight, letting her eyes adjust instead to the wash of stars overhead, thick and close the way they only get out here, far from any town big enough to dim them. He meets her at the rail, pressing his head over the top board the way he's done every night this week, and she rests her palm against the warm plane of his cheek, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing settle under her hand. She doesn't have a name for him yet. She's been putting it off, some superstitious part of her worried that naming him would make this feel finished, when really it's only just beginning. Months, maybe years, of slow work ahead. A sanctuary still more idea than structure. A debt still owed, even if the immediate crisis is past. A valley that will need convincing all over again the first time something goes wrong. But standing there in the cold dark, her breath fogging in front of her, the letter folded against her ribs and the horse's warm weight leaning gently into her palm, she finds, for the first time in 6 weeks, that the future in front of her feels less like something she's bracing against and more like something she might actually be able to walk into. Ruth's porch light flicks on behind her, a small yellow square in the dark, and somewhere out past the north pasture a coyote calls once, long and thin, answered a moment later by another farther off. The wind has finally dropped for the night, and the whole valley lies still and silver under the stars, holding, for the moment, everything it needs to hold. Brenna stays at the fence a long while longer, one hand on the Stallion's cheek, the other pressed flat against her chest where the letter sits, and she doesn't say anything else out loud. She doesn't need to. Some conversations, she is learning, don't require words at all, only the willingness to sit still, in the dark, with something that's been wounded, and wait, for as long as it takes, for trust to decide on its own that it's finally safe to arrive. If this story found you at the right moment tonight, you already know why. Some of us are still sitting in our own version of that round pen, waiting for something wild inside us to trust that we're not going to hurt it again. If that's you, tell me where you're watching from. Drop your city below, because I read every single one. And if you want to know what happens when the sanctuary Brenna built gets tested by its very first real storm, hit subscribe, because that story is coming, and it's not one you'll want to miss.